The whole town had already decided how her story ended. They decided it the first time the sheriff dragged her past the mercantile with her wrists tied, and they decided it again every morning after, over coffee and gossip, the way small towns decide things, quietly, cruelly, and without ever once asking the person whose life they were deciding. She was the Apache woman who lived alone past the dry creek. She was trouble. She was a thief, a witch, a killer, a curse, depending on which mouth you were unlucky enough to be standing near. Nobody could agree on what exactly she'd done, but they all agreed she'd done something, and they all agreed the rope would find her eventually. I agreed too. God help me, at first I agreed. My name is Eli Pruitt. I run 40 head of cattle on land nobody else wanted, and I keep a ledger of every dollar I spend and every lie I've believed. That second column is longer than the first. This is the story of the morning everyone in Cottonwood Bend gathered in the square to watch her get arrested for the 4th time, and the story of what I did instead, standing there with my hat in my hands like a fool, my heart going like a spooked colt, because I had finally understood something the rest of them never would. Stay with me, because before you judge her, and you will want to, I promise you, you need to know what I know. You need to see what I saw. And you need to understand why, when the sheriff reached for his cuffs that morning, I got there first with a different kind of question. I want to tell you it started with something noble. It didn't. It started with a dead calf and my own bad temper. March in that country is a liar. The days trick you into shirt sleeves and the nights come back to collect what they're owed, and that particular night they collected one of my heifer's calves, froze it stiff in the far pasture where the windbreak had blown down and I hadn't gotten around to fixing it. I found the little thing at dawn, curled up like it was only sleeping, and I stood there in the cold with my breath smoking, and I said some words my mother wouldn't have cared for. I write things down, always have. My father did too, though his ledgers were all cattle and mine got cluttered up with other things over the years, weather, moods, the names of men who owed me money and the names of men I owed. That morning I wrote, 1 calf lost to cold, my own fault, fence, and under it, without quite meaning to, I wrote, bad start to a bad spring. I had no idea. I rode into Cottonwood Bend that afternoon for wire and nails, and whatever news was going, and the news, it turned out, was her. The square in front of the courthouse was full. Not market full, market was Saturdays, and this was a Tuesday. This was the other kind of full, the kind that gathers around trouble the way flies gather around a wound. Men I knew, women I knew, children who ought to have been at their lessons. All of them facing the same direction, all of them wearing the same expression, which is the expression a crowd wears when it has come to watch something happen to somebody who isn't them. I hitched my horse and worked my way to where Bill Hasker was standing, chewing on a matchstick, arms crossed over his belly. "What's the show?" I said. "They got the Apache woman again." Bill didn't even look at me. "Marsh is calling it. Says she was seen out by the Dahlin place the night the barn burned." "Was she?" "Somebody was." Which is not the same thing, and both of us knew it wasn't, but neither of us said so, because it was easier not to. That's a thing I've learned about towns, about people, about myself. It is almost always easier not to say the true thing, and so we almost never do, and the little silences pile up like snow until one day the roof comes down. The Dahlin barn had burned 9 days before, cost them a season's hay and 2 mules and very nearly the youngest boy, who'd run in after the mules and come out with his eyebrows gone and a cough that hadn't left him yet. Everybody was angry about it, and everybody wanted someone to be angry at, and there she was, living alone past the dry creek, brown-skinned and silent and strange, and so of course it was her. Of course. I'd like to say I doubted it. I didn't, not then. I stood there with Bill Hasker and I looked at the woman they were bringing out onto the courthouse steps, and the thought that went through my head was the same lazy, ugly thought going through every other head in that square. Well, probably. They had her by the arms, two deputies and Sheriff Marsh in front of her with his thumbs in his belt looking pleased as a cat in cream. She wasn't fighting. I noticed that first, without knowing yet that it mattered. She wasn't fighting, wasn't pleading, wasn't doing any of the things you'd expect from somebody being hauled up before a crowd that half wanted to hang her. She just walked where they steered her, and she kept her chin level, and she looked out over all of us the way you'd look at weather. Something coming that you couldn't stop and wouldn't waste breath arguing with. She was maybe 30, maybe younger, hard-living ages of face, and hers had known hard living. She wore a man's coat too big in the shoulders, and her black hair was pulled back plain, and there was a stillness to her that I mistook, that whole afternoon, for guilt. I have thought a great deal since about how easily we mistake stillness for guilt. How a frightened man will thrash and shout and we call it innocence, and a woman who has decided that nothing she says will be heard will go quiet, and we call it a confession. Marsh raised his hand and the square hushed. "Now," he said, in the big carrying voice he used for elections and hangings, "you all know why we're here. There's been thieving in this valley. There's been that fire at the Dolan place. And there's been," he paused, milking it, a pattern that follows one person around like a shadow follows a man." Somebody in the crowd said, "String her up," not even loud, just tossed it out there like spitting, and a couple of people laughed, and I remember the woman's eyes moving to find whoever had said it. Not angry, just noting, like she was keeping her own ledger and had just made an entry. That was the first thing that snagged me, that look. I couldn't have told you why. Marsh went on a while. He was good at going on. He talked about safety and about property and about how a community had a right to protect itself. And every word of it was true and every word of it was rotten, because underneath the true words was the other thing, the thing nobody said. She is not one of us, and it is easier to blame the one who is not one of us than to admit we don't know who did it. Then he said the thing that changed my afternoon. "And I'd remind you all," Marsh said, "that this is the 4th time we've had to bring Miss," he stumbled on it, he didn't know her name or didn't care to use it, "this woman in for questioning. 4th time. And every other time we had to let her go for lack of anything at all," said a voice. "Not mine. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't me who first spoke up. I wasn't that brave, not yet. It was old Doc Furman, standing near the front with his black bag like he was always standing near the front of everything, and he said it dry and clear, and it cut through Marsh's speechifying like a knife through fat. 4 times, Sheriff," Doc went on, "and 4 times no evidence. You keep arresting her and letting her go. At some point, a reasonable man wonders whether the problem is her, or whether the problem is that you can't find the real one and she's a convenient place to stop looking." The crowd shifted. You could feel it, that ugly pleasure going a little sour, the way a room feels when someone says a true thing at a party, and everyone remembers they have somewhere else to be. Marsh's face went red. "Now, Doc, I'm just an old man asking a question," Doc said mildly, and there was steel under the mild, the way there always was with him. He'd set bones and closed eyes in that valley for 30 years, and he'd earned the right to ask questions nobody else could. "What's the evidence this time?" And Marsh, God help him, said she was seen. "By who?" And Marsh didn't answer, because the answer was nobody, or the answer was somebody who'd say anything, and either way it wasn't an answer he wanted to say out loud in front of 100 people. That's when I started paying attention, real attention, the kind that costs you something. Up till then I'd been a man watching a show. Now I was a man watching a thing that had gone wrong and pretending it was a show. And there's a difference, and the difference started to itch at me right there in the cold March Square. They took her inside. The crowd, cheated of its hanging, milled and grumbled and started to break up. I got my wire and my nails. I heard 6 different versions of what she'd done, and no 2 of them matched, and that bothered me more than any single accusation would have. A guilty person leaves one story behind them. It's the innocent who collect a dozen because the dozen are inventions, and inventions never agree. I wrote in the ledger that night, by the stove, with the wind working at the fence I still hadn't fixed. Town arrested the Apache woman again, fourth time, Doc F. Asked the only sensible question and got no answer. Nobody knows what she did. Everybody's sure she did it. Reminded me of something I don't like remembering. I sat there a while with the pencil in my hand. Then I wrote one more line, and I didn't sleep well after it. The something is this: that's exactly how they talked about my mother. I don't tell that part to many people, but you can't understand the rest without it so. My mother was a Mexican woman my father married against the advice of every white face in 3 counties. He didn't care. He was a stubborn man and he loved her, and that was the end of the argument as far as he was concerned. But he died when I was 9, thrown from a green horse, snapped his neck, gone before he hit the dirt. And after that it was just her and me and 40 acres of people who'd never wanted her there. It took them 4 years to run her off. They did it slow. A store that wouldn't sell to her, a well that got fouled and nobody could say how. Whispers that followed her down the street the same way they'd followed the Apache woman up the courthouse steps. She's strange. She's not one of us. Something's not right about her. Probably. She left when I was 13. Went back south to her people and meant to send for me and never could. And I stayed because the land was mine by then, and a boy will hold onto the one thing that's his even when it's killing him. I got a letter from her twice a year for a while, then once a year, then a letter that said she was sick, then no more letters. I never saw her again. I'm telling you this so you understand that when I stood in that square and watched them decide the Apache woman's story for her, some old buried thing in me turned over in its grave and looked up. I didn't decide to help her. Nothing so clean as a decision. It was more like a wound I thought had healed splitting back open, and me standing there feeling the cold air get into it. The next morning I fixed my fence, kept my head down, told myself it was none of my business. A man who runs cattle alone has plenty to keep him busy without borrowing other people's trouble, and I am, by nature, a man who keeps his head down. I want that understood. I'm not a hero in this. I'm a coward who got tired, which is a different and lesser thing, and the only reason I'm worth listening to at all is that I know the difference. They let her go again. Of course they did. 2 days in the cell, no evidence, and Marsh turned her loose past the dry creek with a warning that everybody knew meant next time. I heard about it at the mercantile. I heard, too, that some of the younger men were talking, the kind of talk that starts as talk and doesn't always stay that way. If the law won't handle it, you know the shape of that sentence even before it finishes. Everybody in that store knew the shape of it. And everybody, me included, looked at the flour barrels and the coffee tins and said nothing. That was the first time I hated myself in this story. It was not the last. What finally broke it loose wasn't courage. It was a broken wheel and a run of bad luck, which is how most true things arrive, not on a white horse but limping, at an inconvenient hour asking for help. I was hauling posts back from the North Line about a week later when my wagon dropped a wheel in the wash by the dry creek. Cracked the fellow clean through. I was a good 4 miles from home with a load too heavy to leave and the light going, and I stood there in the bottom of that wash cussing my luck when I realized where I was. Her place was maybe a 1/4 mile up the creek. I could see the thread of smoke from her chimney against the dimming sky. Now here is a thing I have turned over many nights since. I could have walked home. 4 miles is nothing to a man used to walking. I could have come back at dawn with a fresh wheel and never gone near her at all. There was no need to knock on that door. But it was cold and the light was going, and I'll be honest because I promised you honesty. I was curious. A week of that woman's stillness had gotten into me. A week of probably. I wanted to see for myself. So I told myself it was about the wheel, and I walked up the creek toward the smoke, and I have never been able to decide since whether that was the bravest thing I ever did or just the most restless. The house was small and tight, and better kept than I'd expected. That surprised me, and I was ashamed of the surprise even as I felt it. I'd pictured squalor, because that's what you're taught to picture. And instead there was a swept yard and mended fences, and a little garden bedded down for winter under straw. A dog came out stiff-legged and low growling, and then a voice said something short in a language I didn't know, and the dog sat. She was in the doorway with a rifle. Not pointed at me, held. There's a difference, and I knew the difference, and I raised both hands slow and empty. "Ma'am," I said, and I felt like a fool saying it, but I didn't know what else to call her, and I wasn't going to call her what the town called her. "My wagon's broke down in the wash. Cracked a wheel. I don't mean you any trouble. I just saw your smoke." She looked at me a long moment. Up close her stillness was different than it had been in the square. In the square it had been armor. Here, on her own ground, with a rifle in her hands and a dog at her heel, it was something more like patience. She was reading me the way I read weather, deciding what I was going to do to her, because in her experience men who showed up at her door always did something. "You're the rancher," she said. Her English was plain and careful, each word set down like she was placing stones across a river. "Pruitt, the one with the Mexican mother." That stopped me cold. "How do you?" "People talk in the cell too," she said. "The deputies, they talk like I'm not there. They said the town ran your mother off." She tilted her head a fraction. "So you know." And that was all she said. "So, you know." But it landed in me like a stone down a well, because she was right, I did know, and she'd seen it in a stranger's face across a jail cell wall faster than I'd let myself see it in my own. I helped her stack some wood while there was light, because you don't just stand in a person's yard, and because my hands needed something to do while my head caught up. She let me. She kept the rifle within reach, but she let me, and the dog decided I was allowed, and by full dark I was sitting on a stump drinking a tin cup of something bitter and hot that she'd handed me without asking whether I wanted it. Her name was Nady. Or that's what she told the town when the town bothered to ask, which it didn't. It wasn't her true name. She told me that plainly, that her true name belonged to her and her people, and not to Cottonwood Bend. And I respected it and didn't press. And I think that, more than the woodpile, was what made her decide I might be a different kind of trouble than the usual kind. "You didn't burn the Dahlin barn," I said. It wasn't a question. Somewhere in the last hour it had stopped being a question. "No." "Do you know who did?" She was quiet a while. The fire popped. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote asked its one question of the night and got no answer. "I know some things," she said finally. "I know that barn burned from the inside. I know the Dahlin boy, the older one, not the one who got hurt. I know he owes money in 3 towns and drinks it faster than he can steal it. I know a burned barn collects insurance." She turned the tin cup in her hands. "But I am the Apache woman past the creek. If I say these things, I am a witch cursing an honest family. If a white man says them, he is a citizen with concerns." She looked at me across the fire, and for the first time something that wasn't stillness crossed her face, something tired and old and just for a second afraid. "That is the whole trouble, Pruitt. That has always been the whole trouble. There is no mouth I can put the truth in that anyone will believe." And there it was. The thing I'd felt itching in the square, said plain by the one person nobody would let speak. I looked into that fire a long time. Then I said the thing that started all the rest of it, said it before I'd thought it through, which is the only way I ever managed to say the brave things. "There might be one," I said. "There might be one," I said, and then I had to figure out what I'd meant. That's the trouble with brave words. They come out ahead of the plan, and then you're standing in the cold with a woman looking at you like you've promised something, and you have to go home and lie awake and actually build the thing your mouth already sold. I rode back to my broke wagon in the dark, hauled the load off it by hand, staked my mule, and walked the 4 miles home under a sky so full of stars it looked spilled. I did a lot of thinking on that walk. Most of it was some version of "Eli, you fool. This is not your fight. You have 40 head of cattle and a fence that eats your Sundays, and no business at all making promises to a woman the whole valley wants dead. But there's a thing that happens when you finally look straight at something you've been looking past. You can't look past it anymore. I'd have to see her now, every time somebody said probably at the mercantile. I'd have to see my mother's face behind hers. And a man can carry a lot, but he can't carry the knowing, and the doing nothing about the knowing. Not for long, not and stay a man he can look at in the shaving glass. So the next morning, instead of fixing my fence, I rode into Cottonwood Bend and I started asking questions. Quiet ones. The kind that don't look like questions. I want to tell you it was clever. It wasn't especially. I just did the one thing nobody in that town had bothered to do, which was to ask, and to listen to the answer, and not to already know what I wanted the answer to be before I heard it. I started with hay. See, I run cattle, and a cattleman knows the price of hay the way a banker knows the price of gold. It's the number your whole year rides on. And I knew, because everybody in that valley knew, that the Dollins had been short on hay going into that winter. Bought late, bought poor, complained about it loud in the store. So the barn that burned, the barn everybody was so grieved about, the barn the woman past the creek was supposed to have torched, that barn had been half empty. There wasn't a season's hay in it to lose. There was maybe a month's, and bad months at that. I found that out from Gus at the feed store in about 4 minutes of talking around it. Gus didn't even know he'd told me anything. He just liked to gripe about deadbeat accounts, and the Dollins were near the top of his list. Owed me since October, Gus said, spitting. Told me they'd square up after and here he stopped and got a funny look, and I knew before he finished that I'd found the loose thread. After the insurance, he said slower. That's what the boy said, square up after the insurance came through. He frowned. Reckon he meant fire insurance, which is a strange thing for a man to be counting on a month before his barn happens to burn. A strange thing indeed. I wrote it in the ledger that night. Dollin barn near empty. Owed money everywhere. Older boy counting on fire insurance before the fire. This is not evidence a court would take, but it is the shape of a man, and I know the shape of that man now. Over the next 2 weeks I built my case the way you build a rock wall, one stone at a time. None of them impressive on their own, all of them useless in a pile until you fit them together and step back and see the thing they make. I learned the older Dollin boy. His name was Cyrus, owed money in Bishop and in Red Fork besides Cottonwood Bend. I learned he'd been seen at the Dollin place the night of the fire, which meant nothing by itself. It was his own family's place, except that his mother had told 3 different people 3 different nights he'd been away in Bishop. I learned that the coal oil the fire had used didn't match anything the Dollins bought local, but did match a can Cyrus had been sold 2 towns over. Little things. Stones. And the whole time I was gathering stones, the town was gathering rope. I don't mean that as a figure of speech, not entirely. The talk at the mercantile had sharpened. The younger men, the Hasker boys, a couple of the Coombs cousins, that mean drunk Purdy who'd sour a christening, they'd stopped saying if the law won't handle it and started saying when. Marsh had turned her loose 4 times, and each turning loose was, to their minds, a failure of the law that gave them the right to be the law themselves. That's how it always goes. That's how it went with the Vasquez brothers over in Red Fork the year before. Hung off a cottonwood for a horse theft, it turned out later somebody else did entirely. Nobody paid for that. Nobody ever pays for that. The valley just held its breath a while and then went back to its coffee. I could feel that same held breath in Cottonwood Bend, and I knew, the way you know a storm by the color of the light before the first cloud shows, that it was coming for Nady, and coming soon, and that all my careful stones might not be stacked in time. I went out to her place more than I should have. That's the truth, and I'll own it. It stopped being about the case somewhere in there, though I'd have died before I said so out loud, and I suspect she knew it before I did. She usually did. We'd sit by her fire and I'd tell her what I'd learned, and she'd listen with that stillness, and then she'd tell me things back not about the case, but about the world seen from where she sat, which was a place I'd never once stood. She told me about her people some, about the reservation to the south she'd left and why, about a husband dead of the coughing sickness in a government camp, and a child also dead, and I understood then where the stillness came from. It wasn't guilt and it wasn't peace. It was the particular quiet of a person who has already lost everything a person can lose, and is simply waiting, without much hope, but without much fear either, to see what the world takes next. "Why do you stay?" I asked her once. "If they hate you here, why not go?" She was a long time answering. The dog had its head on her knee, and she worked its ears with one hand while she thought. "Where?" she said finally. "Not the reservation. There is nothing there for me but graves, and every place is Cottonwood Bend, Pruitt. Every place has a courthouse and a crowd. You think if I went to the next valley they would be kinder?" She almost smiled. It was the closest I ever saw her come to it that night. "No, this creek is good water. The garden grows. The graves I visit are close." She looked at me. "A person has to be from somewhere. They took a great deal from us. I decided they would not take from two. This is where I am from now. I made it so by staying. That is a thing they cannot arrest." I wrote that one down word for word, best I could remember it. I've read it more times than any other line in 40 years of ledgers. The break came ugly, the way breaks do. It was a Thursday. I'd ridden into town to see Doc Furman because I'd decided, after a lot of lying awake, that Doc was the one man in Cottonwood Bend whose word carried and whose word was clean, and that if I was going to lay my stones in front of anyone, it was him. I had it all worked out. I'd show Doc what I had. Doc would take it to Marsh with the weight of 30 respectable years behind it, and the law would turn where it should have turned in the first place. Clean, reasonable, the way things are supposed to go and almost never do. I never got to Doc, because when I came up the main street I found the crowd already gathered, and this time there was no speechifying and no courthouse steps. This time it was outside the jail, and it was the wrong kind of crowd, the kind with its hats already off and its jaw already set, and Purdy up front with a coil of rope over his shoulder like he was going to hang Wash out to dry. They'd taken her again, that morning. Marsh had brought her in on some new nothing, a stolen bridle, of all the fool things, a bridle that turned up later hung on the wrong peg in the wrong barn by a boy who'd forgotten where he put it. But the why didn't matter. What mattered was that she was in the cell, and the town had decided that this time the cell was just a waiting room, and that the law, having failed 4 times to give them a hanging, had at last done them the favor of putting her somewhere they could reach. Marsh was on the jailhouse porch with a shotgun, and to his credit, I'll give him this one thing, he didn't look like he wanted to use it on the crowd, but he didn't look like he wouldn't either. He looked like a man who'd started a fire to keep warm and just realized it had gotten into the walls. "Now you all go on home," Marsh was saying. "There's a process, there's a law, I won't have a lynching in my town." "Your town," Purdy said and spat. "Your town's been robbed blind and burned out while you turned that squaw loose 4 times over. We're done with your process, Marsh." He hefted the rope. "Bring her out, or stand aside and we'll bring her out ourselves." And the crowd made that low sound a crowd makes when it's about to become something worse than a crowd. I sat my horse at the edge of it and my heart was going like a hammer, and I want to tell you exactly what I felt, because it's the truth and it's not flattering. I felt afraid, not brave, afraid. Every stone I'd gathered was in my saddlebag, and not one of them was any use against 40 angry men with a rope. And the smart thing, the safe thing, was to turn my horse and ride for Doc and pray there was time. And part of me wanted to do exactly that, wanted it so bad my hands twitched on the reins. I thought about my mother. For years they took to run her off slow, and nobody ever raised a rope, and she got out alive at least. This wouldn't be slow. This would be over in 10 minutes and there'd be no getting out. And I thought, this is the part I'm least proud of and most honest about. I thought, if I speak up now, they'll turn on me too. The Mexican's boy sticking up for the squaw. That's all the crowd needs to make it a double. That was in me, that cowardice. I want it on the record because the next thing I did wasn't the act of a brave man. It was the act of a coward who was more afraid of one thing than another. I was more afraid of living the rest of my life having watched than I was of the rope, just barely, by a hair, but that hair was enough. I got off my horse. I don't remember deciding to. I remember I was in the saddle and then I was walking, leading my horse by the reins, right up the middle of that street toward the porch, and the crowd was parting for me the way a crowd parts for anyone walking with enough purpose that they assume he's got a right to. I got to the porch steps. I turned around. I looked at them. And my mouth, God help it, went dry as August, and for one horrible second I had nothing. No speech, no plan. Just 40 faces and a rope, and a woman behind a wall who told me there was no mouth she could put the truth in that anyone would believe. So I didn't try to put her truth in my mouth. I put mine. "You all know me," I said. My voice cracked on it and I let it crack. "Eli Pruitt. Run cattle out past the north line. My daddy's buried in your churchyard. And my mama," I made myself say it out loud in that street, the thing I'd spent 30 years not saying, "my mama was a Mexican woman this town ran off with whispers exactly like the ones you're passing around right now. Exactly like them. She's strange. She's not one of us." "Probably." Purdy started to say something and I talked over him, louder, because I'd found it now. The thing I had that they didn't, and it wasn't courage, it was information. And information will hold a crowd for about 90 seconds if you spend it right. "You want to hang somebody for that barn," I said. "Fine, fine. But you got the wrong neck in that cell. And I can prove it, and I got the proof right here in this bag. And if you string her up on a lie today, then tomorrow when the truth comes out, and it will, it always does, every one of you is going to have to look at your children and explain why you hanged an innocent woman because it was easier than being right." That landed. I felt it land. A crowd is a stupid animal, but it is not, quite, a suicidal one, and I just told them their cruelty had a price and the price might come due. "What proof?" somebody said. Not Purdy. Somebody in the middle. And that's how you know you've got a chance, when the question stops being "give her to us" and starts being "what proof?" So I told them. Right there on the jailhouse steps, with Marsh's shotgun at my back and the rope not 10 feet away, I laid out my stones. The empty barn. The debts. The insurance the boy was counting on before there was any fire to insure. The coal oil that didn't come from any store in the valley. Cyrus Dolan seen at the place the night his own mother swore he was in Bishop. One stone at a time, and I watched the wall build itself in their faces the same way it had built in mine, and I watched the rope on Purdy's shoulder start to look, to the men around him, less like justice and more like a thing they'd be glad in an hour they hadn't used. It wasn't clean. A voice at the back yelled that I was sweet on the squaw and would say anything, and that was true enough that it stung, and for a bad moment the crowd swayed back toward the rope. But Doc Furman had come out of his surgery by then, drawn by the noise, and Doc, bless that dry old man till the day I die, Doc walked up beside me on those steps and said, in that carrying voice that 30 years had earned, "I've listened to Pruitt's account. I'd want it looked into before any man here does something that can't be undone." A pause. "I set the Dolan boy's hand last spring. Burned it," he said, "on a lamp. Coal oil burn." Another pause, longer, letting it work. "Funny thing to remember, but I remember." And that was the stone I hadn't had. Doc's own hands, that had touched the evidence a year before any of us knew it was evidence. The crowd went from an animal back to a collection of men, and men can be reasoned with, or at least shamed. And between my stones and Doc's word and Marsh's shotgun, the rope came down off Purdy's shoulder and the street, slowly, sullenly, began to empty. They didn't cheer me, don't picture that. Nobody clapped my back. A good half of them left angrier than they came, angry at me now for spoiling their certainty, because there is nothing a crowd hates worse than being made to feel the thing it was about to do. Purdy gave me a look I'd be careful of for years. But they left. The rope went back in a wagon, and Nady stayed alive behind that wall, and that morning was the entire and total victory. She stayed alive. They didn't let her out that day. Marsh had to send to Bishop, had to gather up what could be gathered on Cyrus Dahlan, had to do the slow grinding work of the law that should have been done from the start. Cyrus ran, which told everybody what they needed to know, and got caught near Red Fork 3 weeks later trying to sell a horse that wasn't his, and the whole ugly knot of it, the debts, the fire, the insurance he'd never collect now, came apart in his own scared confession. But that was 3 weeks off. That evening, the evening of the rope that didn't hang, I sat outside the jail on the porch step long after the street was empty, because I couldn't quite make my legs take me home yet. Marsh let me sit. He even, gruff and shamed, let me talk to her through the little barred window at the side, where she'd stood the whole time and heard every word. "You spoke," she said, through the bars. Her voice was very quiet, in front of them, about your mother. A pause. "You put the truth in your own mouth, because you knew they would not take it from mine." "Wasn't sure it'd work," I admitted. "It nearly did not." "No, it nearly didn't." We were quiet a while. The dog, she'd left it tied at her place, and somebody, some kindness in that hard town, had brought it in, and it lay now in the dust below the window, patient as its owner. The evening came down blue and cold. "Why?" she said finally. The same word she'd used to ask me why she stayed, turned around now and pointed at me. "You could have ridden for the doctor, safe. You chose the street, the rope. Why, Pruitt?" And I opened my mouth to give her some noble answer, about justice, about my mother, about doing right, and none of it came, because none of it was the whole truth, and I'd promised her once without saying so that I'd never give her less than the whole truth, since everyone else in her life had given her nothing but pieces. So I said the true thing, which was smaller and harder than the noble thing. "Because I couldn't stand the thought of the world with you gone out of it," I said. "That's all. That's the whole why. I've spent 30 years keeping my head down and my mouth shut and staying safe, and I looked at that rope and I understood I'd rather die in that street than live the rest of my life safe in a world that didn't have you in it anymore. My own voice went then, and I let it. I don't know when that happened. I didn't decide it. It just got to be true, the way you said, without anybody choosing it." She was quiet a long time behind those bars. When she spoke, it wasn't to answer. It was so soft I almost missed it, and it wasn't in English, and I never asked her what it meant, and she never told me, and I have wondered about it for 40 years. Then she said, in English, plain and careful, each word a stone set across a river, "Go home, Eli, fix your fence, come back tomorrow." It was the first time she'd called me by my Christian name. I went home. I did not fix my fence. I sat by my stove with my ledger open and my pencil in my hand, and for the first time in my life I could not find a single word worth writing down. Some things, I was learning, don't go in the ledger. I went back the next day, and the day after that. I did not yet know what I was going to do, but I was beginning, God help me, to know what I wanted to do, and it was the most foolish, the most impossible, the most certain thing I had ever wanted, and the whole valley was going to hate it worse than they'd hated her. Let them. Cyrus Dahlan confessed on a Tuesday, which felt about right, because it was on a Tuesday I'd first stood in that square and thought probably about a woman I hadn't yet troubled to know. The confession came down from Red Fork in pieces, the way news travels in that country, a writer, a telegram, a letter following after with the details. He'd set the fire. He'd bought the coal oil 2 towns over so it wouldn't trace. He'd meant only to burn the barn for the insurance and hadn't reckoned his little brother would run in after the mules, and when he heard the boy nearly died, he'd gotten drunk for a week and then run, which is the whole biography of a certain kind of man in one sentence. He named the Apache woman himself at the start. When Marsh first came sniffing, pointed the law at her deliberate, because he knew, the way everyone knew, that she was the easiest place for suspicion to stop. He'd counted on the town's own cruelty to cover his tracks, and it very nearly had. That last part is what I couldn't get past, not the fire, the counting on it. A man had looked at Cottonwood Bend and seen, clear as I saw my cattle in the morning, that it would rather hang an innocent stranger than trouble itself to find a guilty neighbor, and he'd built his whole crime on that being true. And he'd been right. That's the thing that kept me up. He'd been right about us. The only reason he hadn't gotten away clean was one broke wagon wheel, and one dead calf and a man whose mother had taught him, without meaning to, what a whisper could do. The town, when the truth came, did what towns do. It did not apologize. Understand that. There was no gathering in the square to beg her pardon, no delegation of shamed faces come out past the dry creek with hats in hand. That's not how it works, and I'd be lying to you if I painted it prettier than it was. What happened was quieter and more cowardly and more human than any apology. The town simply stopped talking about her. The whispers dried up the way a creek dries in August, not with any ceremony, just gone one day, and nobody willing to say where they went. The men who'd carried the rope found other things to do with their afternoons. Purdy left the valley entirely by summer, which surprised no one. And people who'd have crossed the street to avoid her a month before now nodded to her at the mercantile, stiff and quick. The way you nod to a debt you've decided not to pay but can't quite forget you owe. She took the nods the same way she'd taken the whispers, level, unsurprised. A woman keeping her own ledger, marking the entries, expecting nothing and therefore never disappointed. I asked her once, in that stretch after the truth came out, whether it made her angry, the way they'd tried to hang her and then just moved on, like weather passing, like she was owed nothing for it. She thought about it in her long way. Anger is a fire, she said. It needs feeding. I have buried a husband and a child and a whole people's country. I do not have enough left over to feed a fire at Cottonwood Bend. She looked out at her garden, greening now with the spring. They are what they are. The creek is still good water. The graves are still close. I am still from here because I stayed. A pause. You are still here because you came back. And that was as near as she came, that day, to saying the other thing. The thing that was building between us as slow and certain as the season. Because I did keep coming back. Every few days through that spring, then every few days that were really every day if I was honest, which I was trying to learn to be. I mended things she didn't need mended just to have a reason. She let me. She started keeping a second tin cup on the shelf, and neither of us said a word about it. And that second cup said more than either of us managed out loud for the better part of 2 months. I want to tell you it was easy, deciding what I decided. It wasn't. I lay awake over it more nights than I'll admit. Because I knew what it would cost, knew it clearer than I'd known anything since I'd watched my mother pack her one trunk. A white man and an Apache woman in that country in that year, there was no church in 3 counties would bless it, no law that would smile on it. No neighbor would come to the table. It would make me, in Cottonwood Bend's eyes, exactly the thing they'd whispered my mother into being. Strange. Not one of us. It would undo 30 years of keeping my head down in one afternoon. And I thought about my father. Stubborn man, married my mother against every warning, didn't care. Died young and left her to the wolves he'd sworn to protect her from. Was that love, what he did? Or was it just stubbornness that ran out when his neck snapped and left her worse off than if he'd never singled her out for the town's attention at all? I turned that over and over. I didn't want to do to Nadie what he'd done to my mother, pull her into the light of my choosing, and then not be strong enough to keep her there. So I made myself a promise before I made her any. I promised I would not do the thing halfway. I would not offer her a life I wasn't man enough to defend. If I did this, I'd do it with my whole spine till the day I died, and the valley could hate us both into our graves, and I would not once, not for 1 hour, let her stand in it alone the way my mother had stood alone. Once I'd promised myself that, the rest was just picking the day. Here is how the town found out, and here is why the title of this whole telling is what it is, because I've come to understand that the story isn't really about the fire or Cyrus or even the rope. It's about one morning in that square and what everybody expected and what happened instead. Cyrus Dahlan was brought back through Cottonwood Bend in June, in irons, to be held over for the circuit judge. It was a bigger event than the truth of his guilt had been. Folks will always come out for a man in chains more readily than they'll come out to admit they were wrong about who deserved them. The square filled the way it had filled that first Tuesday in March. Same square, same crowd near enough. Same faces wearing the same expression. The one a crowd wears when it's come to watch something happen to somebody who isn't them. And Nady was there. She'd come in for salt and thread, ordinary as anything, and gotten caught in the gathering crowd. And I saw her at the edge of it, still level, that man's coat too big in the shoulders, watching them bring in the man who tried to hang her by pointing a lie at her name. Nobody was looking at her. That was the strange, sad triumph of it. 3 months before, 100 people had stared at her and seen a witch. Now she stood in the middle of them and was invisible, because the town's attention had a new object in irons, and the town's attention was the only thing that had ever made her exist to them at all. I was across the square by my horse, and I looked at her standing there, invisible in the crowd that had wanted her dead, and something in me that had been building since March came, finally, all the way to a boil. Because I knew what came next in a scene like this. Everyone did. The scene had a shape, and the shape was: the guilty man gets marched to the jail, the crowd gets its look, and somewhere in the milling and the muttering, some fool would remember the Apache woman was standing right there, and the old cruelty would stir. She's still strange, ain't she? Still not one of us, and who's to say she wasn't mixed up in it somehow? And it would start again. It always started again. A town that will hang you once for nothing does not learn gentleness. It just waits for the next Tuesday. I could feel it coming the way I'd felt the rope coming in May. Everyone in that square, if you'd asked them, would have told you the same thing was coming. Everyone expected another arrest. If not that day, then soon. The story had only ever had the one ending for a woman like her, and everyone in Cottonwood Bend, in their bones, was waiting for it to arrive. So I decided to give the story a different ending, out loud, in front of all of them, where it couldn't be taken back. I crossed the square, same walk as the jailhouse steps in May, leading my horse, purpose enough that folks parted from me without thinking to ask why. I walked straight to where she stood, and the nearest faces turned, curious, and the curiosity spread out from us in a ring the way it does. By the time I reached her, a good part of the crowd had swung its attention off the man in irons and onto the rancher crossing the square toward the Apache woman, and the muttering started, and I heard it, and I did not care. That was the whole freedom of the thing. For the first time in my life I stood in front of that town and did not care what it whispered. She watched me come, level, but her hand had gone still on the strap of her market bag, gripping it, and I knew her well enough by then to read the small tells under the stillness, and she was braced. Braced for trouble, because a man crossing a crowd toward her had only ever meant trouble. I took off my hat. I don't know why that, of all things, hushed them, a man taking off his hat. But it did. It rippled out through the crowd, that small strange gesture, wrong for the scene, and the muttering faltered because nobody could fit it into what they expected. You don't take off your hat to arrest somebody. You don't take off your hat to accuse. Taking off your hat is what a man does in church, at a graveside, at a wedding. It belongs to the holy things, and the town knew it, and the wrongness of it in that square full of chains and old cruelty stopped them dead. My heart was going like that spooked colt. My mouth was dry as August, same as the steps in May. But I'd said the hard, true thing once in front of them and lived, and I found I could do it again. Nady, I said her name. The one she'd given the town, not the true one. The true one was still hers, still not theirs, and I'd honor that till I died. But her name, said plain in front of all of them, the way you'd say the name of a person, who is from somewhere, whose name is a thing that cannot be arrested. Everyone here, I said, and my voice carried, cracked and carrying, has been waiting for one more arrest. I know it, you know it. You've been waiting since March for this to end the way you always figured it'd end for a woman like her. I turned my hat in my hands. Well, I'm tired of that ending. I've been tired of it my whole life. My mother got that ending. I've decided I won't stand in one more town and watch it happen to somebody. I ran out of the speech there. I'd had more of it planned, riding in, all sorts of fine words. They all left me. And what was underneath when the fine words left was the small true thing. So I gave her that instead, in front of all of them, hat in my hands and my whole spine in it like I'd promised myself. Marry me. You could have heard a pin drop in that square. You could have heard the June wind in the cottonwoods and the chains on the man they'd all forgotten to look at. Not because you need saving, I said, fast now, because I'd started and there was no stopping. You never needed saving. You've buried more than any of us and you're still standing and you'll still be standing when we're all dust. Not because of the fire or Cyrus or any of it. I'm asking because I came back. Every day I came back. And you kept a second cup on the shelf. And I've spent 30 years keeping my head down and staying safe and being from nowhere. And you told me once a person has to be from somewhere. And you made yourself from here just by staying. My voice went. And I let it go in front of all of them. And I want to be from wherever you are. That's the whole of it. That's the whole why. I want to be from wherever you are for the rest of my life, and I don't care who's standing here to hear me say it. The town stared. Nady stared. Somewhere a woman gasped, and somewhere a man said something ugly under his breath, and I heard it and it didn't touch me. It couldn't reach the place I was standing in. Nady did not answer quickly. Of course she didn't. She never did anything quickly. She set each thing down careful, a stone across a river. She looked at me a long moment and then, and this is the part I've carried 40 years, the part worth more than any deed to any land, she looked around. At the crowd. At the 100 faces of the town that had wanted her dead, all of them turned now on the two of us. All of them for once in their lives struck silent and unsure. She looked at them slow, one face to the next, the way she'd looked at whoever said string her up that first Tuesday, keeping her ledger, making her entry. And I understood what she was doing. She was making them witness it. She was making the whole town that had tried to erase her stand there and watch her be chosen, out loud, in the light, making them the audience to the exact opposite of the ending they'd been waiting for. She was taking the one thing they'd always used against her, their attention, their whispering, staring judgment, and she was making it hold still and see her. Not as a witch, not as a stranger. As a woman a man had crossed a crowded square to ask for, hat in his hands, whole spine in it. Then she looked back at me. And something moved in her face that I'd only ever seen the ghost of before, that thing that wasn't stillness, that thing underneath. And it came all the way up this time, all the way to the surface. And I saw that her eyes had gone bright and her jaw was working the way a person's does when they've decided, after everything, after all of it, to let themselves want something again. She reached out. She took my hand with the hat in it, both together in front of all of them. And she opened her mouth to answer.